to speak on the report which deals with the electoral legislation amendment, electoral funding and disclosure reform bill. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, principally the proposed amendments which arise out of this bill are: 1, to ensure key political actors that spend significant amounts on electoral expenditure are subject to appropriate disclosure obligations, with obligations commensurate with their level of electorate expenditure. Secondly, that they clarify that spending solely on issue advocacy is not treated as electoral expenditure, when that spending is not aimed at influencing voting in a federal election. This has been the main concern for charities and other organisations that lobby on laws where those groups do not also seek to influence voting in elections. And thirdly, they seek the amendments override state laws to the extent that they would prevent donations or compel reporting of donations that were made for Commonwealth electoral purposes or are available for Commonwealth purposes. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I listened intently to the member opposite who is on the committee, and I'm not on the committee, but this is an issue that I've been following closely. Now, I also note that the Labor members of this committee provided a dissenting report in respect to recommendation 10. Now, it's unclear what the Labor members of this committee, their reasoning of their dissent. And it's important that we pull this apart, because during the committee hearings, the committee heard evidence from Professor Anne Toomey, who is, as most of us would know, is a constitutional law expert, and specifically in relation to recommendation 10, she said this, and I'll quote: "These provisions need to be altered to ensure that the Commonwealth law does not purport to override the state law, where the donation is used for the purpose of state electoral expenditure." She then went on to say this, and this is important: "Certainly, if it is used for Commonwealth electoral expenditure, then the Commonwealth law should prevail over the state law." Now, of course, Section 109 of the Constitution, the Australian Constitution, provides this: "When a law of a state is inconsistent with a law of the Commonwealth, the latter shall prevail, and the former shall, to the extent of inconsistency, be invalid." Now, the committee recognises that to the extent that any proposed amendment of the Commonwealth seeks to override a state law in relation to state electoral matters, then that would be an overreach on the part of the Commonwealth. But where a state law seeks to effectively override a Commonwealth law on Commonwealth electoral matters, then Section 109 will rule that state law to be invalid. Now, those members opposite want to talk about transparency and consistency. Well, they can't get much more transparent than Section 109 of the Constitution. Section 109 of the Constitution is patently clear. It is patently clear that where this state law, or any state law for that matter, or a territory law, is inconsistent with a federal law, then those state laws should be ruled down. Now, this is a fundamental issue that has been identified by the committee. I don't quite understand why the committee is concerned in instances where recommendation 10 accepts that the original proposal of the Commonwealth may have overreached to the extent that it may seek to impact upon state laws. But that is not the case now. The Commonwealth recognises that, and the government wants to work closely with the opposition to ensure that Section 109 is protected and is made very, very clear that these federal laws, the federal electoral laws, to the extent that we are talking about the Commonwealth's right to enact legislation which impacts upon federal electoral matters, cannot be impacted deleteriously by state legislation. Now, if those members opposite want to try and argue something different, well, then go for your life. I'd like to say, though, Mr Deputy Speaker, that a first-year law student would be able to identify that simply that position is absolutely untenable. And should the need arise, if it means that the Commonwealth has to expend taxpayers' money on fighting this matter in the High Court, that is assumedly what we will do, and I hope it is what we would do, because the right thing to do is to ensure that the federal parliament, that its right to enact legislation on federal matters, it takes precedence over a state or a territory. Bless you. I'll take that interjection. Mr Deputy Speaker, but it's important to recognise that, that the recommendations that have come out of this committee are not purely just in relation to this one issue. It is vitally important that we, as a federal government, we as a parliament, ensure that we have open and transparent provisions, particularly in relation to our electoral laws. We want to ensure that, to the best of our ability, that we have situations where foreign players, whether they be a foreign government, whether they be a foreign party, that they, if they are going to make electoral donations to perhaps try and influence the outcome of a federal election, it is only right and proper that the Australian people are identified, or that the Australian people are notified of that a particular company or a particular government or an external third party from another country is identified as just being that. Without that clear transparency, we see a cloud that will descend upon this parliament, as we have seen in other countries. And I, for one, want to ensure that we don't head down that same route as other countries have. We want to have the strongest electoral laws, I believe, in the world, to ensure that we have that openness and transparency, to ensure that foreign players are identified as exactly what they are, and the Australian public can be assured that any donations that are made are clearly identified as coming from an international third party. I don't think that that is too much to ask, and I call upon those members opposite who provided that dissenting report on just this one issue, on recommendation 10, that they work with the government to ensure that the primacy of the Australian Parliament is protected. Those members opposite can't have it both ways. They can't argue that the state laws should somehow, irrespective of the merits of what that state law might be. The simple fact of the matter is you cannot escape Section 109, and those members opposite would know it, or at least they should know it. And that they ought not try and argue that a state law, irrespective of what they would regard to be the merits of that case, should somehow override a federal law where it is inconsistent. Now, that's not rocket science. It's something that is very, very plain and simple, and this federal government, our federal government, will act to protect the primacy of any Commonwealth law, and I thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.